Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Attila Brungs, and it's my great privilege to be the Vice-Chancellor here at UTS. It is also my honor to welcome you to the second annual UTS Vice-Chancellors Democracy Forum. And before we begin proceedings, and on behalf of all of those present, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that UTS stands. I'd also like to acknowledge the Greene people, where my house stands, and that's where I'm dialing in from this morning. But I'd also like to pay respects to elders past and present, acknowledging them also as the traditional custodians of knowledge for these lands. And knowledge is at the heart of what we are as a university. Knowledge is at the heart of what a university can bring to debates in society, to discussion. That knowledge is what we use to try and help society through tough times. I'd also like to warmly welcome all our guests joining us today. Many from nearby, but also some from far-flung lands, particularly our very special guest today, Rana Foroohar, who's joining us from the other side of the world in the USA. As you might know, today's discussion is the second in a series of annual talks focused on the critical theme of democracy, engaged citizenship, public purpose, and social cohesion. For those of you who know me, I'm extremely passionate about these topics, both personally, but also because it is part of a university's contract with society to be a place where students can learn to play an active role in the world, where they and the wider academic community are free to discuss, to debate ideas, different views, different perspectives, and share knowledge about the world in which we all live. Today's event will explore how the use of technology by citizens, civil society groups, governments, affect core aspects of democracy and democratic representation. So I think it's incredibly fitting that today we're joined by Rana, global business columnist and associate editor at the Financial Times, as well as CNN's global economic analyst. As an author, Rana's first book, Makers and Takers, The Rise of Finance and the Fall of the American Business, about why capital markets no longer support business, was shortlisted for the Financial Times McKinsey Book of the Year in 2016. Her most recent book, Don't Be Evil, How Big Tech Betrayed Its Foundation Principles and All of Us, is a Porchlight Business Book of the Year for 2019. Today, Rana will be interviewed by Emeritus Professor Roy Greene, the Special Innovation Advisor here at UTS. Roy graduated with first-class honours from the University of Adelaide and his PhD from the University of Cambridge, where he's also a research fellow. For those of you who know Roy, he's worked for many years in universities, business and government, both here and overseas, advised and published widely in the areas of innovation policy and management, as well as trends in business education. He's undertaken research projects with the OECD, European Commission, and other international bodies. But before I go, I'd once again like to thank you all for joining us today, for you to be part of this important, critical conversation that we have on democracy and the world in which we live and shape. Over to you, Roy.
Thanks, Attila. As everyone is no doubt aware, Attila is leaving UTS next month to transfer his skills to UNSW. This will be one of his last events with us. So we're very sorry to see him go, of course, not least because of his championing of initiatives like this one, but I'm sure you will join me in wishing him well and great success in his continuing leadership of the higher education sector. The good thing is he will not be too far away. We're delighted to host Rana this morning, her evening in New York, in our series on the future of democracy. Rana is best known to global audiences through her columns in the FT, where she covers an immense array of topics from post-COVID economic recovery to labour market inequality to the housing crisis. Yes, America has one as well. She has won prestigious awards for her writing, including for the books Attila mentioned. We will focus today on the themes of those books around big tech, financialization, and public policy responses in the context of what many perceive to be a threat to democracy in our interconnected world. As this is a conversation, I will be putting questions to Rana over the next 30 to 40 minutes, and I hope we will also have some time for your questions before we finish. So please use the Q&A function on your screen, not the chat function, the Q&A function, and we will get to them if we can. So turning to you, Rana, since your influential book, concerns have been growing about the seemingly unaccountable power of big tech. So alarmed are governments in the US, Europe, and here in Australia that legislation is being introduced to curb this power. And in China, such action is already being taken albeit in a different political context. Against this is the view that big tech is an engine of innovation, which is simply meeting the needs of business and consumers. So how do you see the rise of big tech? Is it a clear and present danger to democracy? And do the measures envisaged by governments go too far or not far enough?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Roy and Attila, and for the opportunity to speak with you here today, morning your time, evening mine. It's a bit darker here. Those are many important questions, and let me try and step way back and set the context. The development of the internet, the consumer internet, which let's say started in the mid-1990s, is absolutely a transformative technology of our time. And I see it really akin to the development of the industrial internet, the military internet that came before it, but also development of telephony, the development of the railroad 100 years ago. This is a technology that is and will transform our world. And that's a great thing in many ways. If you look back in history, big bursts of shared productivity growth tend to come when there is a transformative technology and it is underwritten in some ways by the state, as in fact the development of the internet and the railroads were, and then privatized by the private sector and commercialized and rolled out through society. We've now left, I would say, the first stage of the development of the internet. We're in maybe the end of the stage one, beginning of stage two. And I think we're beginning to see some of the fallout and some of the negative externalities of this. Clearly, just as you had 100 years of religious wars after the development of a technology like the printing press, you're seeing a tremendous growth in populism, nationalism, misinformation, all of these negative externalities from the development of the consumer internet and digital technologies, and in particular, the rise of the platform technologies. And the platform technologies, to me, are in some ways the apex of the last 40 years of neoliberalism. Globalization as it's been practiced, let's say, since the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, has really been about capital, people and goods being able to move wherever they will, and more recently, data being able to move. But one of the issues with this system is that capital and now data have been able to move much faster and much less transparently than either goods or people. And so what you have now is a paradigm in which companies themselves have come to rival the power of countries. And Australia is, perhaps the best case in point of this, as we saw last spring with the government's fight against Facebook and Google, and the fact that Facebook can now literally turn off the news in an individual country for days on end. That really says something about the power dynamics. So I kind of see the rise of big tech as maybe the beginning of the end of this neoliberal paradigm, the beginning of an era in which you see that the Washington consensus is broken. We don't quite know what the Beijing consensus is going to be, but we certainly have a Facebook consensus. And we do see governments now taking action around this, but we're not there yet. We don't have a solution, and we can maybe dive into some of the particulars of what's happening globally if you'd like.
It's on that question of platform technology, and you liken it to the railroads and possibly other platform technologies that we've seen in the past. Those were tackled by, in the end, very vigorous antitrust competition policy measures. This is a new kind of technology, and it may not be as receptive to such measures. The administration has appointed a very interesting new trade commissioner, Lena Khan, different view about antitrust from the kind that was adopted in the Roosevelt era. Can you elaborate what that might mean in tackling perhaps even the way in which these large technology companies are gobbling up all their competitors and apparently, according to recent evidence, doing so at an increasing pace, almost exponentially.
Yeah, 100%. So as you mentioned, we are going through some major regulatory shifts in the US. The Biden administration has come in and appointed a very tough group of regulators to tackle antitrust issues, Lena Khan being case in point. Lena is part of really a movement. The new Brandeis movement is what it's known as in the US. And it's referring to Louis Brandeis, who is the big trust buster from the Roosevelt era. So Brandeis was a judge and a politician and a thinker who eventually brought to heel some of the big industrial giants, the oil and steel conglomerates, the coal conglomerates. And he was really all about tackling power and vested interests and power within the context of the political economy. And that's something, interestingly, that may seem obvious to some of us, but was actually lost during this last half century of neoliberal thought in the Anglo-American world, let's say, and in many OECD countries. So Robert Borg, another important legal scholar in the US, was part of this University of Chicago school of thought that informed the Reagan-Thatcher years and all the regulation that happened since. And his contribution to the sort of legal scholarship was the idea that consumers are all that matters. If prices are going down and consumers are happy, then there is no monopoly problem. There is no power problem. There is no asymmetry between a company and society at large. He didn't think much about society, he thought only about consumers. And that's been the precedent that has really ruled antitrust policy in the US since the 1970s onward. Now in the US, unlike in some other countries, it's really about the body of law that is built up and the precedent that is set. And so the precedent in the States has been a company can get really as big as it wants, as powerful as it wants, as long as prices are going down, everything's okay. But as you pointed out, these platform giants actually sort of fall outside the boundaries of that school of thought, in the sense that when you and I engage with Facebook or Google, we're not giving our dollars, we're giving our data. It's a barter transaction. We don't really know what we're giving up. It has some value, and it particularly has some value when it's collated throughout the course of a day or a week or a lifetime, and then pooled with other people's data. So just as an example, my camera right now can see where my eye patterns are going. If I was on a shopping website, that would be tracked. That would be put into a sort of a creation of a voodoo doll of me. All my data patterns are being tracked, and those can then be sold to the highest bidder in the form of targeted advertising. That's the business model that has been built over the last 2 decades by the platform giants. And by the way, as I covered in my second book, this was something that they completely knew about from the very beginning. If you go back, it's quite fascinating actually. If you go back to the original academic paper that Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the founders of Google, wrote at Stanford when they actually came up with the idea for a search engine. They lay out what a search engine would be, how it would work, but then how it might be monetized. And they actually called out the risks of targeted advertising in that paper. And they said, if you do pay for a search engine through targeted advertising, you are going to leave society vulnerable to bad actors, both in the private sector or the public sector. And that's exactly what we've seen. So there are these tremendous asymmetries of information. We're not paying anything, except we are paying something as individuals and as a society. It's just not transparent. So just to kind of finish, I think this new Brandeis school of legal thought, by going back to the original 1930s idea of power as something that exists in the political economy, and just as you all have seen in Australia, as many of us have seen in our own countries, through the lobbying efforts of these companies, through the ability of them to literally shut down government, This is a big issue, and I think it's something that is going to take fire in other parts of the world as well.
So thank you for that. But some would say, and certainly the large technology companies would say, that this might be a price worth paying to have a behemoth of a company to transform our society, to contribute to innovation and productivity. You really need bigness in order to carry this out. So they will say perhaps that we will introduce data privacy provisions and all sorts of checks and balances. But in the end, society benefits from having such large companies. And if you broke them up or pursued a different type of industrial structure, you wouldn't get that level of innovation that they have contributed. What would you say to that?
Well, so, 100%. Do I want search to go away? No. Do I care about Facebook? Not really, although perhaps some people do. But, Amazon, Google, sure, these companies are providing pretty vital services at this stage. I mean, we saw that really during the pandemic. It was a bit like a scrim had been pulled up, and we all suddenly realized how much we needed all of these digital products and services. But if you look back again in history, think about the railroads. The railroads were privatized at one point, and boy, that was a vicious business back in the day. I mean, you can go and read some history about the wars between different railroad barons and the way in which they would literally buy politicians and then take them for cross-country trips on their railroads to show that they had various legislators in their pockets. But eventually, these essential technologies were turned into public utilities of a sort. Common carrier rules were used during the era of telephony to create a sort of an even playing field and make sure that there was a price that people were able to pay for these vital services. I think that's absolutely what we need to be thinking about now. We're not thinking broadly enough on regulation, I feel, at this point. We're sort of picking at different bits and bobs. The conversation about privacy is in one basket. The conversation about antitrust is in another basket. There are conversations about making people pay for content, which I think is absolutely valid. But ultimately, we need to say, look, this new railroad of the 21st century was bought and paid for by taxpayer money, in the sense that the internet was a government service. Much of the research that has underwritten these companies was paid for by the public sector. They are now essential to living, working, being educated. They need to be public utilities. They need to be regulated as such, and they can certainly be allowed to make a profit, but they cannot be allowed to make 42% profit margins, which was what Facebook made in a recent quarter, at the expense of not just others in the economic playing field, but civil society.
I guess the challenge for regulators in this case, and this is the distinction from the railroads, is that these are international companies. How do you see, if we're moving towards a situation where these companies ought to be treated like public utilities, how would you undertake such an effort across international boundaries?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a timely question, because as I'm sure you probably know, next week in Pittsburgh is going to be the first inaugural US-EU Tech and Trade Summit, which briefly we thought it was going to be scuppered by the AUKUS deal. The French were pushing for it to be postponed, but that's now off. The conference is going ahead. And this is interesting. This is potentially the beginning of a template building on some of the alliances that are already happening between the US, Australia, UK, et cetera, for a new paradigm for digital tech and trade and security in the 21st century. And I think that what we're seeing is that we are living in at least a bipolar, if not a tripolar or a multipolar world right now when it comes to these issues, for the very reasons that you say. China is going a completely different direction on tech and trade regulation. We're seeing that now, and we should perhaps parse that a bit more carefully as well. But they've made it quite clear in their 5-year plan that they want to be completely independent of Western technology within the next few years. they're well underway to doing that. It's clear from some of the curbs on the big tech companies in China recently, and even individual CEOs, that the state is firmly in charge. There is no presumption of privacy. This is surveillance capitalism on the part of the big state at its highest level. And that is what it is. You know, we can make a value judgment on that or not, but I believe that system is antithetical to liberal democratic values. So now the question is, are developed nations, the US, Europe, Australia, India, Japan, that are perhaps not part of that Chinese paradigm, are they going to come up with a shared system? And are they going to bring these companies to curb? Because right now we're living between big tech and the big state. And it's really a matter of coming together as liberal democracies and saying, here are the standards of behavior. Here's how you're allowed to operate in the 21st century economy. And this issue is only going to get more pressing with COVID. I mean, one of the things I'm thinking a lot about is how we may be about to see the kind of disintermediation of high-level white-collar work globally and outsourcing of that to lower wage countries that we saw in the manufacturing sector. COVID has shown us that much more work can be done remotely. Well, it's no accident that software that will strip out foreign accents and put an American accent or a British accent or an Australian accent in are now being sold and invested in by countries like the Philippines or India. This is going to create a tremendous amount of populism and just put on steroids some of the trends that we've already seen. So now is the time for governments to be coming together and having this discussion. And I'm really hopeful, and in fact, I'm pegging my Monday column to this, I'm really hopeful that we're going to see some action or at least some statements to this effect in Pittsburgh.
Well, you raised the issue of populism, and we've seen over the last few years the role that social media and big tech can play in political events and even in elections. The US election, obviously, 2016, the Brexit referendum, and the danger that that can pose. I'll just bring in a question from one of our audience members at this point, and Bruce Tulloch asks, who should decide what constitutes misinformation versus political speech online, and how should it be done?
Well, let me start by saying who shouldn't be deciding this? Companies. And that's what's happening right now. It's being decided on an individual basis by individual companies. They're not good at doing this. You know, these were companies that got into the platform tech business in part because the profit margins are huge because you don't have to employ a lot of people. So now they're coming in and they're trying to become journalists. They're trying to become arbiters of the truth. They're really not that good at it. And in fact, it's rather ironic that you even have companies like Facebook begging for regulation in the sense of, please tell us what to do because we keep screwing this up. You know, they're taking full page ads in the New York Times saying it's time for a new set of regulations for the digital era. So governments really have to set the standards here. And I think that the standards on things like hate speech, misinformation may differ from country to country. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Germany may have stronger feelings about certain kinds of hate speech than, say, the US would. I think that those are decisions that can be made and perhaps should be made locally, but they should certainly be made by elected governments, not by companies.
Just broadening out the questions a little bit. Over the last 15 years, we've seen crises on a number of fronts now. The global financial crisis, obviously climate change, and now public health crisis associated with the COVID pandemic. And this has led to government intervention on an unprecedented scale, with more money being injected into economies, growing public and private debt, and booming share markets. But even though these large technology companies and many other companies adopting new digital technologies have made a contribution to innovation, we see at the same time a productivity slowdown. Very puzzling, together, of course, with wage stagnation and reduced economic dynamism associated with financialization of the corporate sector. I wonder if you could make sense of these developments for us.
So you're using the word financialization, which was the topic of my first book, Makers and Takers. And that book really tracked exactly the trend that you're talking about. So if you take the post-war era in a country like the US, there was a lot of shared growth, incomes were rising as GDP was rising. There was a story in which the fortunes of the country and companies and individuals were linked. You know, things were going in the same direction. That started to diverge really during the Reagan-Thatcher era, and in particular in the late 1970s when certain shifts were made, particularly shifts around the idea of shareholder value. You know, the Chicago School, Milton Friedman's idea of shareholder value, and the idea that the share price is really the only metric that matters for a company. This pushed the economy in a certain direction. It gave us a lot of globalization, a lot of outsourcing, a lot of cheaper goods, but it didn't necessarily raise incomes or productivity for long stretches of time. And that's because the incentives were misaligned. So a company that's being judged on share price is going to do what Wall Street wants, which is lower costs, marshal capital, outsourced to the cheapest wage countries. If you're investing in something that's not going to pay off for 5 or 7 or 10 years, which is typically what most serious technologies require, kind of productivity enhancing technologies and ideas, then you're going to be penalized. So you see that companies from the 80s onward, as they start to do things like invest in the future, their share price takes a hit. Whereas if they go in and do financial balance sheet manipulations, like, for example, buying back their own shares, which actually used to be illegal, it was illegal until 1982, has now become a very commonplace thing. In fact, share buybacks have been booming in recent years. What this does is artificially bolster the value of shares because you're taking some off of the open market, but it doesn't really change the story on the ground. It's not like inventing a new product or you know, putting a new factory up and paying people, hiring people and paying them more. It's a completely financially engineered saccharine high. And unfortunately, our system in the Anglo-American world, I think, has encouraged this, and it has led to an asset bubble, which is what we're in right now. We have share prices that are way up here. I mean, even in the midst of 10 years of, you know, great financial crisis, now the pandemic, any number of disasters in between, climate, trade strife, you still have share prices at record highs, even though you have growing inequality. So that divergence between the financial economy and the real economy, which is part and parcel of this neoliberal system, I think has really come to an end. And I suspect that when central bankers finally pull away the punch bowl of easy money and easy monetary policy, that we're going to see a major correction. And the only question in my mind is whether governments can act before that to start to create incentives for some real productivity growth. I mean, things like what you're seeing in the US and in Europe, actually, with the CHIPS Act, you know, trying to say, look, is it right that we should have outsourced 92% of all of our advanced semiconductor manufacturing to Taiwan, a rather contested country? You know, maybe we should incentivize through the public sector more production at home. Maybe we should take a slightly more, you might call it, Germanic approach of saying we're not just a country of consumers, but we're also a country of producers. And we want to incentivize both things, and we want to make sure that we're getting growth in the real economy, not just in the asset base.
So those are very live issues here in Australia as well, and we've been watching with great interest the Biden administration's efforts, not just to introduce a big stimulus package, which it's doing, but also an even bigger one to rebuild research and innovation, reverse educational inequalities, and reduce carbon emissions in line with the 2050 net zero pledge. These are very bold measures, and they've been compared with Roosevelt's New Deal in terms of scale. And these are the approaches that you mentioned earlier to antitrust policy. Do you think they're adequate, even if you get that very big package through. Do you think they're adequate to meet the challenges that you outlined? And I wonder if you could speculate for us on their chances of success, not just in the Congress, where it's all in a bit of gridlock, but also in terms of their substantive success should they succeed in being approved.
So I love that basket of questions, and I particularly love that you're acknowledging the ambition of the administration, because I think that that's something that many people in America don't understand, and certainly many people abroad don't really understand. This president is, I think, doing nothing less than trying to change the entire nature of the US economy. And one great example of this was the executive order that came down a few weeks ago around competition and monopoly. For starters, the idea that a president was going to give an executive order for every part of government to look at where concentrations of power might be, look at the vulnerabilities those might cause in everything from food security to national security to wages and wage stagnation. I mean, that's a big deal. I'm not sure any president has ever said we're going to look at concentrations of power across the entire government and made that an executive order. But what was very interesting is the wording of this executive order. Biden specifically called out Robert Borg. Going back to my earlier point about share prices being the most important thing, and consumer prices, as long as they're falling, it's all okay. He said, no, we've left the Borg era. We're going to think about workers, small businesses, civil society, trade partnerships, and consumers last in that basket. So that was a really big deal. Now, you start with narrative. You have this big idea, big narrative. Then how is it going to be implemented? Well, the thing that the president has done so far is to set forward this major infrastructure plan. $3.5 trillion is what the progressives would like to see. Unfortunately, you're now starting to see, there always was a Republican sentiment to not spend so much, but you're starting to see moderate Democrats also say, well, the debt and deficit issue is a big deal. Interest rates may rise at some point. Maybe we should have a more modest plan. So what's going to get built? Are we going to choose bridges and roads, or are we going to choose rural broadband? Are we going to bolster the care economy, which is where a lot of jobs will be? I mean, in a way, care is a kind of an infrastructure, and that's another topic that the administration is trying to take on. So it's very unclear, A, whether we're going to get a bill passed, B, whether it's going to be closer to 1 trillion or 4 trillion. But I think within that is the larger question of, are institutions still functioning? Is our government functioning? I mean, can we, even with a progressive president and Congress, can we pass a bill that actually, puts our money where our mouths are? And I think that is up for grabs right now. I'm hopeful, but I think we're going to know a lot more in the next couple of weeks.
Yes, it seems very precariously balanced. And it is so important to the future of the US economy, as it is for everyone. How do you think the injection of that new political element, the competition with China for technological supremacy, plays into that discussion in the US? Because we recall at the beginning of the year when Biden took over, he wrote a letter to his chief science advisor, Eric Lander, really modeled on the letter that Roosevelt wrote in the 1940s, setting out all the big challenges, as you've described them, really around how do we rebuild research and innovation, how do we address issues of public health, how do we solve inequality, and he wanted research and innovation to play a very big part in that. And of course, very sharpened by international developments now. How do you think that might impact on the political attitudes in the US, as well as the outcomes?
Well, we're definitely at a turning point. I mean, it's quite fascinating because, I've been covering business and the global economy for over 30 years. And there was a time period in which you could not question basic neoliberal tenets. It just wasn't done. You couldn't question conventional globalization. You couldn't question whether there had been important losses from the outsourcing of certain parts of the supply chain to China. Now you can, and you can do that not only on the left, but on the right. And in fact, there's a kind of an interesting overlap in some ways between the progressive left and the far right. The left is concerned about jobs and the loss of manufacturing, which has been the major job creator in not just the US, but in most rich countries for many years. The right is worried about national security. In both cases, you have this sense that, wait a minute, we may have given up too much to China over the last 20 years. And I think no one at this stage can really with a straight face say that China played by the WTO rules that it had pledged to play by when it was admitted. So that's something that's kind of a political certainty at this point in the US. Now, the question is, what do you do about it? I personally feel that the US needs to focus on strengthening its own economic ecosystem and that of its allies, rather than, say, going after China. I think the Trump point of just focusing on tariffs and the trade balances was really misguided. What you need to focus on is the innovation ecosystem. And the truth is that you do need to keep some of that localized or regionalized in order to benefit from the innovation that comes from that. So if you look at an industry like semiconductors, for example, it's iterative. In the West, we thought, well, we'll just keep the software here and everything else can go abroad. But in fact, innovation works when things are coupled, when you have R&D, software development, labor, manufacturing, all happening together so that there can be learning and incremental innovation. This is something that I think is going to become a bigger deal probably in the midterm elections and also in the next presidential election. We're not going to somehow replace all the jobs lost in the China shock, which is the name of an important piece of research around this topic of the last 20 years. But we do need to rebuild some of that innovation ecosystem, because if you take the position that China has its own economic orbit, it is rebuilding the old Silk Route trade path through the One Belt, One Road system. It is unabashedly mercantilist, and it doesn't have assumption of privacy, and there's surveillance capitalism. Well, then you have to say, if I am not okay with that, I'm going to have to rebuild an ecosystem, at home and with allies. And so I feel like that's something that people are really coming to accept. The White House put out a pretty strong supply chain report in July, end of July, about this, and really broke down just how much concentration there is of crucial technologies in Asia and why it's important to rebuild at home, but also to work with allies to come up with, again, this sort of shared understanding of what the trade and technology ecosystem should look like.
And you raised in there the vulnerability of supply chains, and certainly we've found that here in Australia, where manufacturing has declined down to levels way below most of the other OECD countries, around 6% of GDP now, from 12% at the beginning of this century. And there's a lot of discussion here about how do we recapture manufacturing, but in a different way, perhaps, than was done previously. Not to produce everything that we need in Australia, but certainly to ensure that we have capability in key areas of our economy and that we build new areas of competitive advantage. And I wonder how that discussion is playing out in the way that you've just described there to rebuild the US economy in this context. What kind of measures do you see as being potentially effective in rebuilding manufacturing, but doing so in the digital era when labor costs are not the key competitive issue?
So that's a great question. There's a really interesting confluence of things happening. And I think that some of these things would be happening even without the geopolitical strife of the moment. One of the things that's happened in the last 20 years is that wages in Asia have gone up. So you also have a larger consumer base in places like China. So suddenly entire industries like textiles, for example, or furniture that had been outsourced from the West to Asia, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have really far-flung supply chains for things like cotton. At the same time, you now have human rights concerns. Cotton in Xinjiang, this has become a major issue, a brand issue for companies. Human rights violations, how are those going to be dealt with? Is it okay to be importing cotton from a place like that? Textiles are a low value industry, but when you think about, all right, suddenly you have an industry like the Carolina cotton industry that is competitive again. When you factor in wage rates, energy arbitrage, energy prices rise, that raises the cost of transporting things. Okay, maybe you bring back some of the textile work, but then are there interesting ways in which you could connect that low value work to higher value industries? So there's a big push you mentioned in one of your questions earlier, and I didn't quite answer it, around clean tech in the US. And electric vehicles in particular are an area of priority for the administration. And you have big companies like GM saying that they're going to produce within the next 10 years or so only electric vehicles. Well, could you have factories that might make low margin t-shirts also connecting in to do upholstery for an electric vehicle? Could electric vehicles be part of the regeneration of energy grids in cities? You know, you start to connect these dots a little bit, even at the local level. And I can see it, in fact, just in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, I can see this happening. You have many neighbors getting subsidies to put solar panels on the roof. You then plug into a local grid where you're charging the Tesla, you know, and these pieces begin to come together and make sense. I think that you're going to see more and more of that. I mean, you're already seeing it, and you always had, and I'm sure you have in Australia as well, some places that didn't outsource, some places where local paradigms actually held. In the US, it's interesting, places that have a lot of family-owned businesses tended to keep more of the entire supply chain local. And that's because they're not so beholden to Wall Street and the share price pressure, and they can do more investing. And you see some of those areas like Ohio, for example, becoming a real jobs and innovation hub because you do have those local ecosystems still in play. So I suspect that either a little bit from the top down or perhaps even more from the bottom up, you're going to see that connection happening.
Yes, I think that's happening to some extent here. Certainly some communities are rebuilding their own ecosystems and developing clusters of competitive advantage in sourcing a lot of what they do locally. That is perhaps much more closely aligned with European models, where if there's a closure of a large company in an area, people don't leave, they just they try to find other areas in which they can apply their skills. We're coming close to the end, and I'm going to circle back to big tech. Got an interesting question from Simon Buckingham-Shum. I'll just read it out. We now understand that maximizing time on site incentivizes material that appeals to our worst selves. Populations now live in completely different information worlds. What are the most promising initiatives you're seeing to explicitly promote alternative business models, incentivizing behaviors more likely to promote societal cohesion?
Wow, what a great question. You know, I should start by saying that the reason that I wrote my second book, Don't Be Evil, it sort of dovetails with this, and I have a bit of a personal story maybe to share. I have a 14-year-old boy as well as an 18-year-old girl. At the time that I was writing this book, my son was 12, and I became interested in the topic because I came home one day and I opened a credit card bill, and I noticed all these strange small charges in increments of $1.99, $5, and I thought, my gosh, I've been hacked. Well, it turned out that they were all from the App Store. And so I thought, who has my Apple password? Oh, my 12-year-old son. And I interviewed him, and I found out that he had become literally addicted to a video game that was purposefully marketing to children something called loot boxes. where you're in a game that is, again, supposedly free, but in fact you're buying things along the way to make you better, faster in the game. This is now, actually there's legislation in train in the US to make that illegal, and to bring digital rules around marketing to children in line with offline rules. And that's a very basic thing that we can all do. I mean, just simply take the rules of fairness, human rights, values that exist in the offline world and bring them into the online world. Well, you can't market tobacco to children on TV. Well, why should you be able to sell them these loot boxes online? But it was really fascinating to see that he was addicted to this product and being pulled through this game. Now, I think that there are business models where, let's say, a product online could be monetized not based on just eyeballs, but on what can get me someplace best or fastest. I'm looking for just the right product and I want to get there quickly. That could be something that you might pay for. But these companies often have a hard time clawing their way into the marketplace because the existing platform paradigms are so dominant. And that's where I think antitrust is going to slowly but surely start to play a role to open things up.
Right, yes. Know all about those games from my own kids in the past. And I think we might have time for one or two more questions. Here's one from Manal Al-Sharif. Interesting. According to the Influence Map report, oil and gas companies paid in 2020 at least $9.5 million to Facebook to mislead people about the role of oil and gas on climate change. So big tech is part of delaying climate action. What are your thoughts on this?
Fascinating question. You could substitute the word oil and gas for many other campaigns, nefarious goals. One of the things that's been pushed for recently in the US is for big tech firms to kind of open up the algorithmic black box and show us who's paying for what. And in fact, there are now some rules around political advertising, for example, not so much around corporate advertising. But the companies have been very, very resistant to this, because I think once you really open up and start to see, what money they're taking from where, what it's doing, not only to our children, but to our politics, to our society, you very quickly are on a slippery slope. There was actually a fantastic series recently in the Wall Street Journal about just what Facebook is taking money for and how and why. And it's really, you think you can't be shocked anymore, but you are when you read these revelations. I think algorithmic auditing can play a role in some of this, but ultimately there's just going to have to be clear rules. What can these companies do? What can't they do? And they'll have to be set by governments.
And talking about rules, I guess our conversation wouldn't really be complete without addressing the issues of the gig economy, which is really becoming a very important part of the labour market, especially for young people getting their first jobs, and a lot of people locked into the gig economy as well, with the casualisation and precarious nature of new work as it's emerging in the technology ecosystem as a whole. Big tech, perhaps, in the social media context, not so involved in this, but other aspects of big tech are, and very much on growth paths, resisting legislative control, resisting the idea that the people operating rideshare companies and so on are employees as opposed to independent contractors. And we've seen a lot of interesting and quite conflicting court judgments on this around the world. I wonder what your perspective is on the gig economy, on labour market inequality in that context, and where we might go in terms of public policy.
Well, one of the basics of capitalism is that markets don't work when there's an asymmetry of information. Adam Smith would say you need equal information about a transaction on both sides. You need shared access to what's being bought and sold. and you need a shared value system. And none of those things are in play in many aspects of the digital economy, but particularly when it comes to gig work. If you just think about an Uber driver, for example, I will pay a higher rate, a far higher rate than many people to get where I'm going because my time is valuable to me. I've got 2 kids to pick up. So, you know, when I plug in my my rideshare request, they're going to charge me 3 times as much. They have access to that information. The driver does not. The driver cannot leverage that information. The driver is being completely controlled by the company. The schedules are, you know, they wreak havoc with their lifestyle because of this, and it's a completely unequal market. Unfortunately, lobbying dollars have prevented, actually in California recently and also in some other states, the recognition that gig workers are actual workers. And if someone is driving for you 40 hours a week, if you're not paying them benefits, you know, that doesn't mean that they're not working for you. I do think that slowly but surely you're going to see those rules overturned. You've seen some positive rulings in the UK and in other parts of Europe around this. I think also you're going to start to see labor playing a more active role in regulating the digital economy. A lot of labor unions are advocating for data trusts and data pools in which workers, consumers, governments would have equal access to information and also the value from that information. I mean, I could give you several examples of this. In Toronto, the Sidewalk project, Google was at one point going to take over 40 acres of Toronto waterfront and essentially privatize all the data. And finally, politicians woke up and said, no, you know, this is owned by individuals, by the public commons, and we're going to make it publicly available so that any company, any consumer, and governments themselves can access it. I think that that's where we're going ultimately. We have to, because if you think about the amount of wealth that is now in data and intellectual property, 80% of corporate wealth is living in 10% of companies that have access to all this information. That is only going to increase as we start to see all these technologies roll out in the healthcare sector, in the financial sector. And so the math really stops working in the labor market and in our economy and in society if we don't recoup some of that value.
And we've pretty well reached the end of our time. Thank you for that, Rana. Just one very quick one. One of our colleagues there, Russell Lansbury, asks whether the FT and the quality press can play a role and what role it might be in countering false news as we see projected in much of social media.
Well, I hope that we can. You know, I mean, we have very rigorous fact-checking standards. We are all professional journalists, but we operate on a subscription model. And so people are paying us to be right. They're paying us for the truth. And we're an expensive product. You know, in America, you pay $400, $500 for a print subscription and just as much for a digital subscription. So that's great for the people that can afford the FT, and the FT does a lot of philanthropy, giving it away to universities and schools and so on, but it does really go to your earlier point of the wealth divide and the information wealth divide. You know, a wealthy person can pay for the truth. Many people that aren't so lucky are going to Facebook for their news, and we have to fix that.
So on that note, thank you, Rana. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think everyone will have found it very informative and very enlightening. And hopefully they'll also go to your books and also go to your FT columns, to which I'm addicted. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to our audience for joining us. We have over 600 people tuned in today, tremendous number of people. And thank you to Attila, our Vice-Chancellor, and to Julie for helping us get this whole event organized. And good evening to you, Rana, and hope everyone has a good day today and weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roy. Thanks to everyone for listening.